Hello, students. Welcome back to your history class. I am Mrs. Jenny Shah, and we are doing the last chapter, Paths to Modernization. In last class, we read about the daily life of China, and uh, we saw, last class, we read about the war that the China did with China and Russia, the one that Japan did with China and Russia, and how it won both of it. And then it developed economically, and it also acquired a colonial empire and suppressed the spread of democracy at home and put it in collusion with the people that it colonized. Today, we will talk about the modernization of the economy. Another important part of the Meiji reform was the modernization of the economy. Funds were raised by levying an agricultural tax. Japan's first railway line between Tokyo and port of Yokohama was built in 1870 to 72. The textile machinery was also imported from Europe, and foreign technicians were employed to train workers, as well as to teach in universities and schools, and Japanese students were sent abroad. In 1872, modern banking institutions were launched. Companies like Mitsubishi and Sumitomo were helped through subsidies and tax benefits to become the major shipbuilders, so that Japanese trade was from now on carried in the Japanese ships in themselves. Zaibatsu, which is large business organizations which are controlled by individual families, they were the ones who dominated the economy up till the end of the Second World War. The population was 35 million in 1872 and it increased to 55 million in 1920. To reduce the population pressure, the government actively encouraged migration. First, to the northern island of Hokkaido. This island had been largely autonomous area where the indigenous people were called Ainu. They lived, and then they increased the migration further to Hawaii and Brazil, as well as to the growing colonial empires of Japan. Within Japan also, there was a shift to towns as industry started to develop. By 1925, 21% of the population used to live in cities. And by 1935, this figure went up to 32%. The number of people who were in the manufacturing increased from 7 lakh in 1840 to 40 lakhs in 1913. Most of them worked in units employing less than 5 people and using neither machinery nor electric power. Over half of these employed in the modern factories were women, and it was the women who organized the first modern strike. After 1900, the number of men began to increase, but only in the 1930s did the male workers begin to outnumber the women. The size of the factories also began to slowly increase. The factories employing more than 100 workers, just over 1,000 in 1909, now jumped to over 2,000 workers by 1920, and this increased to 4,000 workers by 1930s. Still, in 1940, there were over 550,000 workshops that employed less than 5 employees. This sustained the family centered ideology, just as nationalism was sustained by a strong patriarchal system under the emperor, who was like a family patriarch. The rapid and unregulated growth of the industry and the demand for natural resources such as timber led to environmental destruction. Tanaka Shozo was elected to the first House of Representatives, which launched the first agitation against the industrial pollution in 1897, with 800 villagers in a mass protest, forcing the government to take some action. So Tanaka Shozo, he was the first he was the first one to be elected to the House of Republics Representatives, and he launched the first agitation against the industrial pollution. He was a self-taught son of a farmer, and he rose to become a major political figure. He participated in the popular rights movement in 1880s, which was a movement demanding constitutional government. He was elected member to the first Diet. He believed that ordinary people should not be sacrificed for industrial progress. The Ashio mine was polluting the Wateros River, ruining 100 square miles of farmland and affecting 1,000 families. The agitation forced the company to take pollution control measures so that by 1904, harvests were then back to normal. The Meiji Constitution was based on a restricted franchisee and created a diet. Diet is the Japanese use the German word for parliament because of the influence of German legal ideas. Okay, so the Meiji Constitution created a diet with limited powers. The leaders who brought the imperial restoration continued to exercise power and even establish political parties. Between 1918 and 1931, popular elected prime ministers formed cabinets. Therefore, they lost power to national unity, cabinets formed across party lines. The emperor was the commander of forces from 1890, and this was interpreted to mean that the army and the navy had independent control. So the Meiji constitution created a parliament called Diet, and this had limited powers. The leaders who restored the Meiji government, they were the ones who controlled the power. They found political parties and they also formed the ministries. Slowly, they lost the power to national unity, and now the cabinets were formed according to the party lines. The emperor was the commander of forces, and from 1890, this was interpreted to mean that the army and the navy had independent control. In 1899, the Prime Minister ordered that only military generals and admirals could become ministers. All these strengthened the army. The strengthening of army was related with the fear that Japan was at the mercy of the westernized powers. This fear was used to silence opposition to military expansion and to hire the taxes to fund the armed forces. Successive generations of Japanese intellectuals had different views on Japan's relations with the other countries. To some, the USA and Western European countries were at the highest point of civilization, and by this, Japan was aspired. Fukuzawa Yukichi, who was a leading Meiji intellectual, he expressed that Japan must expel Asia. He meant that Japan must shed its Asian characteristic and become a part of the West. Fukawa Yukishi, he was born in an impoverished samurai family. He studied in Nagasaki and Osaka, learning Dutch and Western sciences, and he later on even learned English. In 1860, he went as a translator for the first Japanese embassy to the USA. This provided the material for a book on the West, written not in the classical but in the spoken style, and it became extremely popular. He established a school that is there even today, the Kyo University. He was one of the core members of the Merikusha, a society to promote Western learning. In the encouragement to learning, he was very critical of Japanese knowledge. He said that all that Japan has to be proud of is its scenery. He advocated not just modern factories and institutions, but cultural essence of the West and the spirit of civilization. With this spirit, it would be possible to build a new citizen. His principle was heaven did not create men above men, nor did he set men below the men. This is Fukuzawa Ukichi. It's Yukichi. The next generation was questioned this acceptance, started to question this acceptance of the Western ideas. It questioned this total acceptance of Western ideas, and it urged that the national pride should be built on indigenous values. The philosopher Miyake Setsuri, he argued that each nation must develop its own special talent in the interest of world civilization. He said, to devote oneself to one's country is to devote oneself to the world. By contrast, many intellectuals were attracted to the Western liberalism and wanted Japan based not on military but on democracy. Oiki Imori, who was a leader of the popular rights movement, was demanding a constitutional government. He admired the French Revolution's doctrine of the natural rights of men and of popular sovereignty, and he spoke for a liberal education that would help each and every individual. He said that freedom is more precious than order. Others even advocated voting rights for women, and this pressure led the government to announce a constitution. So, Uiki Imori argued for popular sovereignty. He spoke for the liberal education that would develop every individual, and he said that freedom is more precious than order. Others advocated voting rights for women, and all this led the government to announce a constitution. Japan's transformation into a modern society can be seen also in the changes that it underwent in everyday life. The patriarchal family system gave way to the nuclear family system. The patriarchal household system used to comprise of many generations living together under the head of the house. But As more and more people started to become affluent, new ideas of the family started to spread. And the new home, or homo as the Japanese say, was that of the nuclear family where the husband and wife lived as breadwinner and homemaker. This new concept of domesticity in turn generated demands for new types of domestic goods, new types of family entertainment, and new forms of housing. In 1920, construction companies made new cheap housing available for a down payment of 200 yen and a monthly installment of 12 yen for 10 years. This at a time when the salary of a bank employee was 40 yen a month. So the new middle class families started to enjoy the new forms of travel and entertainment. Transport in cities improved with the electronic trams, and public parks were opened in 1878. In Tokyo, the Ginza became a center of fashionable area. The first radio station opened in 1925 and movies began to be made in 1899. Many companies started to make films. There's a paragraph there is an extra article on page number 241 which enlists all the changes of the daily life. You should go through it. In page number 241, it's the blue box called the Car Club. It's the carpool system. Next class, we will start with overcoming modernity. Okay, and how Japan re-emerged as a global economic power. With this, children, I end today's class. Stay home, stay safe, take care, keep learning. Thank you.